Chapter 7. Frostpine placed the lid on the sample box. Daja gave it one last rub. Carol took it to the girl in the yellow habit of the air temple who waited in the doorway. She balanced a wooden crate nearly filled with sample boxes in a wheelbarrow. Carol placed his burden there, shut the crate, and fastened the leather strap that kept the lid on. The girl thanked him, giving the big youth a sidelong glance, then turned the wheelbarrow and trundled it away. "Perhaps you should help her," Frostpine suggested as he winked at Daja. "She looks strong, but such loads are delicate." Daja noticed that Kirill's skin turned a nice shade of crimson. "She seemed to like you," she pointed out, massaging her fingers. "I'll see her at supper," Kirill replied. "Her and her girlfriends eat at the table close to mine." He brushed his white habit, trying to wipe away soot marks. "Are your hands all right?" Frostpine asked Daja, putting away the rest of his tools. "I know engraving is hard, but you did so well that I didn't think to ask." Daja tucked her hands into her tunic pockets. "I'm just surprised they're empty," she said. "How many days have we been at this?" "I lost track," Kirill remarked wearily. He ladled water from the barrel and poured it over his long braids, blowing like a whale. Frostpine slung one arm around Kirill's wet shoulders and another around Daja's. "You did fine work," he told his students. "Only the healers and Lark and Sandry are working harder." He let them go. "Daja, my pearl, you can return to discipline tonight if you'd like." "I would," Daja replied. "Did we make enough of those things?" "They have enough to last a month, and tomorrow we are going to rest," Frostpine announced as they went outside. "Here, watch it!" cried a man just when they would have walked out onto the spiral road. 4 wagons rolled by, each carrying novices and fire and earth temple dedicates. They were armed with picks and shovels. Still more wagons followed, laden with canvas, empty carry baskets, and lumber. "What's all this?" Frostpine asked one of the drivers. "Setting up a hospital camp," replied the woman, an earth temple dedicate. "Hospital camp and an open pit for burning the dead." When Frostpine and his students stared at her in shock, she said, "Where have you been? The blue pox is everywhere in the city. Erda's house and the water temple are full up. Duke's clearing out a warehouse and they're building a camp uphill at the mire. Pits to be dug on Bit Island." Her wagon rolled on, bound for the south gate and the road to the city. "Briar?" asked Daja, reaching through their magical connection. "Are you all right?" She was suddenly frightened for him and Rosethorn. "I'm fine. Go away," Briar replied firmly. Daja was cut off as crisply as if he'd slammed a door in her face. As Briar stalked down the hall to the room where Flick was, a healer stopped him. "Mask, gloves," he said tiredly. "We've fresh ones on the table. Use them." Briar wanted to tell him off, just as he told Daja, but the man looked so weary over his own mask that Briar decided it wasn't worth it. He put the shotgun down and helped himself to a mask. A sense of Lark and Sandry washed over him as herb-scented cloth pressed his nose. He could almost see their faces. Their magic was so powerfully written into the undyed cotton. The gloves were the same. Fitting them over his hands, he felt as if Lark and Sandry stood at his back, keeping him safe. That made him feel small. "Daj," he called out sheepishly. "Daj, I'm sorry." He could feel the traitor's hurt, as sharp as if he'd cut her. Then Daja too relaxed. "It's bad there?" "Bad enough," he replied, stroking the shotgun's wrinkled trunk. "Ain't you heard?" "Only a bit, just now," she told him somberly. "We've been making sample boxes round the clock, with breaks for cat naps." She felt exhausted to him. Now he was really ashamed of himself. "Sleep and eat," he told her sternly. "Lots of both." "One epidemic and you're a master healer?" she asked, amusing threading her weariness. "That's it," he agreed, mock serious. "Tell 'em at home me and Rosethorn miss 'em." "I will," she replied, drawing away. Feeling better for the contact, Briar carried his tree into the ward he'd left that morning. His bed had been filled. "You aren't sick," replied a healer when he protested. "You shouldn't be here." Briar settled his tree on the shelf behind Flick's cot. "I should be, and I am," he said firmly. "I'll see to my mate here." The term wasn't strictly accurate. A mate was someone who stayed with you in dire times, as the girls had with him the year before. Still, he was as much of a mate as Flick was going to get. Lifting his eyebrows, he asked, "You want to argue?" "Just keep out of my way," the man warned him, moving on to other beds. That was easy enough. Flick had sunk into a high fever while Briar was out. He checked her mouth to find her tongue as dry as paper. Her cracked lips bled, her skin was ashy and dry. When he pinched her gently, the fold he'd made in her skin flattened very slowly. He'd been around healers to know that this was the worst possible sign. His friend was drying up inside. His heart pounded heavily. What was going on here? He thought she was on the mend that morning. Looking around, he saw the homeless man, Yuvash, was gone. A kid Henna had brought in, and one of her old people were missing too. "Dead," said a healer, not the one who told him he didn't belong there, when he asked. "Yuvash, did you say his name was?" "Had a stroke. The old woman in her sleep. Her heart stopped. It was quick. The little boy went into a coma and died. Fever cooked his brain. Your girl started to heat up about an hour after you left. You won't be able to give her enough liquid to make a difference," she added, as Briar grabbed a clean jar and filled it with water. "We'll see," he said grimly, filling a smaller jar with willow bark tea. He marched back to the bed, determined to do battle. Flick's response was not encouraging. She swallowed 2 mouthfuls and let the rest dribble onto her blanket. "Open your eyes," Briar ordered, trying to sit her up. "Come on, Flick. You're drier than the rooftops at Warp Moon. You have to drink." Flick's eyes popped open. "Ma, don't!" she cried, raising her hands against an unseen threat. "I'll learn, I will, only don't!" Her head snapped back. She keened deep in her throat and curled into a ball. "I'll be good! I'll be good!" she whispered, sobbing. "Flick, drink this," Briar said, badly frightened. "I know it's nasty, but it'll help." Flick sat up with a grin. "There's a haul and proper nicks," she sang out. "And food enough for everybody after the dirt mayor gets his cut." Briar got the cup to her mouth and tipped it, pouring half down her throat. She drank, thinking it was part of the food she'd stolen in her waking dream. "Nah, give 'em dates to the littles," she announced. "Too bleatin' sweet for me. How about some of that wine there?" Briar filled the cup from the water jar and raised it to her lips, but he was too late. Flick lay back, eyelids fluttering. "You want Petticoat to work the bag trade. She's got lingo. Gimme wharves any road." She slept briefly, her breath rasping in her dry throat, and woke to still more hallucinations. As the healers closed the shutters for the night and supper was brought to those who could eat, Briar learned more about Flick's early life than he ever wanted to. He wished tiredly that he could find the monstrous mother who figured so vividly in his friend's cries. Worse, he wished he'd never heard of Flick. He hoped that she would die so he could get some rest. The last thought made him despise himself. Her life was surely worth more than his winks. He was a monster to think it. As penance, he fought her to drink more liquid. When she refused, he helped tend those on either side of her. One of them was Orjai, the other homeless man who had come in the second day. He slept lightly, muttering in his dreams, but he drank when he was told, and he wasn't as hot as he'd been. Just after the Guildhall clock struck midnight, Flick went stiff, her body turning into a bow. Just her head and feet touched the bed. She collapsed as Briar and a blue-robed healer ran to her cot, then arched again, unbreathing, eyes rolled up into her head. "Get her feet," snapped the healer. She threw her body across Flick, grabbing her wrist. While Briar hung onto the girl's feet, the healer took a breath and exhaled. Her magic surged like fast-growing vines through Flick's arms, into her straining chest. Flick collapsed, gasping as she tried to suck air into her dry throat. Breathe, the healer urged Flick. Breathe as hard as you... Flick whined, her back arched as her eyes rolled up. Now the healer sent power racing through her, filling the girl's skin with magic only Briar could see. The magic's light fluttered in Flick's arms and legs, and it receded, trickling back into her body almost as quickly as it had filled her limbs. This time Flick's convulsion was shorter. Breathe, chanted the healer softly when she went limp. Breathe, breathe. Briar was confused. Why was it important for Flick to breathe? Wasn't it Henna? Yes, she'd said that in the long moments without air, parts of the brain died. People with seizures forgot to breathe. Erda, no, thought Briar, scowling at his friend. Don't leave her an idiot. Flick tensed again. 2 more seizures followed, the healer never once loosening her grip. Each time it took her more effort to thrust her magic into Flick's body, and it never lasted as long inside the girl's skin as it had the first time. When Flick had lain quiet for a while, the healer let go. Briar, who'd been knocked repeatedly into the bedstead, was happy to release the girl's feet. Could I do that? He asked the healer as she gulped down cold water. Put my magic in them to keep them going? Are you a healer? The woman asked tiredly. Can you run your power through another human being? Only my mates, these girls I know, and Rosethorn. The healer looked at him, really looked for the first time. Yana, bless me, you're one of the 4, aren't you? The boy, the plant mage. Briar nodded. The healer massaged her temple. You might do it with those girls in Rosethorn, but we would have been told if any of you could heal. Could I try? Asked Briar as the healer lurched to her feet. Try all you like, she replied. Nothing will come of it. She hesitated, then touched Flick's head. Once again, Briar saw magic, but its gleam was just visible. The woman was nearly drained. She pursed her lips. Flick'll be fine, snapped Briar, annoyed by the healer's rejection of the idea that he could do this kind of magic. I hope so, she replied, moving on to the next bed. Sitting beside his friend, Briar held her wrists as the healers did. Magic was magic. It could be lent to other mages. He'd seen that, had done it himself. Let him bleed off some now, when there was some good to be had. His store of power wasn't the same as it had been that morning, before he and Rosethorn had gone downstairs, but he still had some. He pictured Flick's veins like veins in a leaf, and urged his magic forward. It was like trying to leap off of a cliff, only to find he was still on even ground. There was no place for him to go. Again he tried, imagining her veins as a web of roots. His power moved in him, but went nowhere. A hand on his shoulder jolted Briar out of a half-trance. It doesn't work, Rosethorn said wryly. I've tried. How's she been doing? Briar described Flick's seizures and the shrinking amounts of magic that the healer had fed his friend. Rosethorn frowned as he spoke. When he was done, she said, I'll be back shortly. She left him there. Can I have water? Orjai whispered from the next bed. My head aches. Briar scooped water into a cup and helped raise the man so he could drink. Looking for Rosethorn as Orjai gulped water, Briar saw her arguing softly but ferociously, from the look on her face, with the healer who tended Flick. The healer pointed to the other cots and shook her head. Was she telling Rosethorn she'd already helped those people and was drained of magic? Or was she saying that there were others who needed it more than Flick? It didn't matter, decided Briar. She wouldn't help Flick, even if she could. The healer's shoulders drooped. She leaned on the table as she argued with Rosethorn. She was nearly played out. Finally, Rosethorn left the room. Briar returned to his watch over Flick. Some time after the Guildhall clock struck 1, Flick passed into unmoving sleep. The clock was ringing in the half-hour after 3 in the morning when the consumptive man began to cough himself to death, noisily and bloodily. Orjai tried to stuff his blanket into his ears to escape the sound. Briar trembled, wishing he could do the same. Suddenly the noise ended. Those in the room who were able to understand made the God circle on their chests. Flick slept through it all, unmoving, her breath rattling in her throat. Briar tried to get her to drink tea or water, but it ran from her loose mouth. You have to get well, he told her fiercely. Come on, Flick. You're a fighter. Remember that time we was on the wharf and them traitor boys tried to run us off? Tris, Sandry, and Daja knew of this adventure, but their teachers did not. We showed 'em, right? You even got a fine cloth cap out of it. Sky blue, with a peacock feather. And the pump we saw told you it was worth 3 silver crescents. Flick's breathing slowed, as if she did remember, as if she savored the memory of either the victory or the hat. Cheered by that, Briar talked on. Once we're sprung from here, I'll ask Sandry to make a cape to go with the hat, same color and everything. He was breathing along with Flick, though he didn't realize it at first. Her body clawed for air like a weary fisherman hauling in nets, a handful at a time. There was always a halt when Flick stopped inhaling. Each time Briar stopped when she did, waiting longer and longer for her to start again. He silently begged her to let go of her lungfuls of air. He couldn't talk as well as breathe with her, to help her, so he shut up and clutched her hand, watching her chest slowly rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall, rise, rise, fall, fall. He emptied his chest and waited. She was about to breathe in, about to at any moment, except Briar choked and gasped, inhaling frantically to fill starved lungs. He wheezed as spittle went into his airway, then coughed and coughed until he yanked the mask from his mouth and drank water straight from the jar. When he lowered it, Flick still hadn't moved, hadn't filled her lungs. She had lost so much weight. A skeleton with skin, he thought, taking her hand again. When she got better, he would try to talk the winding circle into taking her. Gorse, the chief cook, would love to bring her to a proper weight. Gorse lived to feed people. Someone fumbled with his hands, but he wouldn't let go of her. After a time, they went away. Briar sat, thinking of the mischief they would find once Flick was on her feet. Fingers of light thrust through a crack in the shutters, telling him it was dawn. Flick would ask for breakfast in a little while. A finger touched him lightly between the eyes. In his mind he saw a silver ribbon of magic. His nostrils flared, tickled by a scent of patchouli, lotus, and other things. Red as blood, a man remarked. You can take him home, Dedicate. Briar. Hands cupped his cheek and turned his head. His eyes met Rosethorn's. Why is there a red thumbprint on your face? He asked. It's Crane's detection oil. If you have the blue pox, it turns white on your skin. If not, it turns red. Yours is red, mine is red, and we're going home. She seemed to be pleading with him. Her tone was gentle. If I get up, I'll wake Flick, he pointed out. Not unreasonably, he thought. My dear, you know better, Rosethorn said. Her brown eyes were level, serious. There was no pity in them. He was glad. Pity would have hurt. Briar looked at his friend. Her fingers were limp in his. Her mouth was slack. No pulse beat in the thin skin over her temple. She was just a shell lying there. Silently, Briar pulled his hand away. He picked up his shotgun, then followed Rosethorn out of the ward. Quarantine had lifted, but no one was taking chances. Once they were outside of Erda's house, they entered the tent that Nico had mentioned, the one beside the road to Winding Circle. The clothes they'd worn were taken away while they scrubbed with medicinal soap, rinsed in hot water, and rubbed themselves in disinfectant oil. When they emerged, they were handed fresh clothing. Briar examined the folded garments and realized that these were his own, from discipline. His eyes blurred. He opened them wide, so no one might see rinse water on his face and mistake it for tears. He dressed, pulling on his second favorite boots. His favorites, he remembered, were gone, destroyed on his first day at Erda's house as a part of the useless attempt to keep the disease from spreading. A squad of the Duke's Guard, mounted on horses, awaited them at the front of the tent. We're giving you a ride to Winding Circle, their corporal told Rosethorn. Honored Moonstream asked us if you turned out to be well. I don't have the blue pox, Rosethorn said bleakly. I don't know if I'm well. The mounts picked their way across along Nosegay Strut, the street that ran past Erda's house to Temple Road, and the fishing village onto the harbor. Briar looked around dully. The day he'd come here with nothing more on his mind than unloading medicines and running about with Flick, the street had been muddy but clear. Now it was strewn with the remains of bonfires, pieces of wood, liquor bottles, and trash. There were heaps of rags, the dead, left to be picked up by the big vehicles mockingly called lumber wagons. 3 buildings showed signs of fire. Another had burned to the ground. Drunkards and beggars leaned on buildings and watched as the guards passed. Doors and window shutters slammed all around. It began to rain as they turned onto Temple Road. On the north edge of the way, several houses had burned. On the south edge, the fishing village had built a wall of barrels and wagons to keep rioters from their boats. As the road climbed into a rocky ground, he saw men and women in street clothes and habits already hard at work. They were putting down plank floors and raising large canvas tents. 3 or 4 giant tents were already taking in the sick. The guards had to swing around a line of wagons carrying fresh victims to makeshift hospitals. A heavy, cooked meat smell drifted into his nose as the wind whipped around. From Bit Island, a thick black trunk of smoke rose to mark where the dead were burned. The guard watched their surroundings, though nothing lay now at their right except the bluffs and below them, the slate-gray waters of the harbor. To their left rose tumbled earth, giant slabs of rock, and whatever plants could get a foothold in such unpromising ground. The greenery drew Briar's eyes. He touched the shotgun he carried in the crook of one arm. I forgot the plants at Erda's house, he gasped suddenly. Rosethorn! They need them more than we do, she replied. Don't worry about it. He dozed, tucked so firmly between his guard that he couldn't fall. He woke suddenly. An animal was screaming. Leaning to look around at the guard, he saw that they had reached a Y in the road, where it split to either side of a well and a shrine. He knew both. Higher on the rising ground soared the gray stone walls. Atop them, warriors in red habits and broad-brimmed hats against the rain leaned through notches to stare at them. Down the road that led to Winding Circle's north gate raced the screeching animal, a big white dog nearly out of his mind with joy. Behind him came Daja, walking sensibly on the firm ground at the road's edge, using her staff to keep herself out of the mud. Triss followed her, raising her skirts as she picked her way across past the worst ruts and dips in the road itself. Last came Lark and Sandry under a big umbrella, the same earth-green shade as Lark's habit. Briar's guard commented, amused. I see there's a welcoming committee. Little Bear reached them first, sending up gouts of muddy water as he raced from Briar's horse to Rosethorn. No one tried to speak. None of them could have heard anything but the dog. Daja stopped by Rosethorn, looking up at her. After a moment she smiled, carefully, as if she were unsure Rosethorn would like it. Briar saw his teacher reach down and wrap her fingers around the trader's dark hand where she clutched her staff. Daja's smile broadened, and Rosethorn let go. Daja came over to Briar, staying clear of Little Bear. Briar looked at her, seeing that she was still tired after long hours in the forge. She gazed up at him for a long moment, then said, You took your time coming home, thief boy. Briar felt his guard stiffen. He tried to smile. I would have been home sooner, if I'd had my druthers. Triss only glanced up at Rosethorn and nodded, turning pink as she did. Rosethorn nodded back. When the red-headed girl reached Briar, she said frankly, You look like you were eaten by wolves. Nothing so nice, he replied, and carefully handed the shotgun down to her. Half turning in the saddle, his guard asked, You're leaving me already? Briar nodded. I must. These girls will just get weepy and embarrass me if you stay. He slid into the road, landing to one side of a puddle. Daja steadied him. Sandry closed the distance between them at a run. Colliding with him, she wrapped her arms tightly around his neck. You dreadful boy, she cried. Don't you ever do that again. He patted her awkwardly and growled, You're making my shirt wet crying on it. Sandry laughed and stood back, wiping her eyes. It's already soaked through. Tris, can't you deal with all this rain? She fumbled in her pockets until she found her handkerchief. Why is it always me? Asked the red-headed without expecting a reply. A circle of dry air opened around the entire group, rain streaming to all sides as if she'd covered them with a glass bowl. The guards glanced at each other sidelong, unnerved by the display of magic. Tris didn't even notice. Sandry blew her small nose briskly and inspected Briar when she put the linen handkerchief away. You need rest, and you need decent food, she announced. Rosethorn hasn't done much better than you. Look for yourself, Daja remarked softly. Sandry turned. Rosethorn had dismounted. Now she stood ankle-deep in mud, arms wrapped tight around Lark, her face buried in Lark's shoulder as the other woman held her. She didn't seem to be crying. She just hung on to her friend for all she was worth. Sandry gathered her skirts and went over to the woman, sliding her own arms around Rosethorn's waist. Daja followed her more slowly to pat Rosethorn's back. Briar went to stand nearby. Tris, crimson with emotion, glared at the guards as if daring them to comment. Their corporal twitched his head. Quietly they turned their mounts and rode back to Summersea. When Rosethorn drew out a Lark's and Sandry's hold, she said crossly, I'm not crying, if that's what you think. I'm just tired. I needed to rest for a moment. Lark wrapped an arm around her shoulders. No wonder. You two look worn to the bone, my dearest. And why not? Locked up for days, like jail, without your garden and only nursing to occupy you? I think Little Bear likes nursing more than you. She drew Rosethorn uphill toward Winding Circle. The four and Little Bear walked along. Lark continued. And I bet Jacobus and his people were talking at you too. As if this were my fault, Rosethorn said blackly and sniffed. But you're all right now, Sandry announced. You're both home safe, and we're going to be fine. The epidemic is far from over, cautioned Lark. We still have work. But we're where we should be. That's the important thing, Sandry replied cheerfully. We're all home.